It's sort of surprising to me that the parable of the Good Samaritan is only in Luke. It's one that we know really well, and yet it's only in one of the Gospels, which perhaps speaks to the power of the parables that Luke uses. We won't go through all of these, just a couple of them. So we'll start with the rich fool. Is there anyone who would be willing to read that passage from Luke 12 for us?
Thanks. Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God."
I have the same three questions, one of which has a typo. But the first is identifying the characters, things, and actions that are in each of the parables and trying to figure out what they represent. Sometimes it's a little more literal. In the case of the rich man, we might literally be talking about someone with a lot of wealth. But I'm curious what characters and actions you identify in this parable that might stand in for something else. And again, since we have folks online, I'll come around with the microphone so that people online can hear us. What's going on here? For one, we have the rich man, which again, this one might be more literal for someone who has a lot of wealth. He's talking about finding a place to store all of his crops. Most of us in this room are not farmers who have to find a place to store all of the grain that we've grown in a year. We're not building silos in our backyard, or maybe you are, in which case you can share that with us. But what might that stand in for? What might be our version of crops that we're storing up? Money, yeah. Our belongings. I know that I have a closet that is very full of clothes, many of which I don't need, but I store them up just in case. For what? I don't really know. But what else do we store up and perhaps sort of squirrel away? Kindness, that's a good one, yeah. Moving away from that literal approach, yeah. Okay. So we've sort of identified what our parallels could be. What is a meaning we could derive from this parable? Why is Jesus bothering to tell this? Why is it important? What was the question? Why is this important? What's the meaning of the parable? Jesus tells it for a reason. What are we supposed to learn? And there can be lots of right answers to that, of course. And that's the beauty of parables, is that we have the ability to interpret. Yeah.
So for me, it kind of seems like, why wait? You know, if I'm considering befriending someone who's wronged me, the waiting and the storing of kindness or forgiveness adds up, along with all the clothes that I also
Yeah.
don't wear.
It's not just material. We can store up our kindness, our forgiveness, and not share that with people as well. Did you have something? Okay.
I think it's important to live life for today and do what's best today as opposed to worrying about what's happening in the future, to make all kinds of complicated plans, hoping that you can direct your life in the future as opposed to just living in the here and now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we can talk about the storing, but we can also talk about that last verse. Oh, darn, we went away again. We can talk about that last verse that is basically saying you can't take it with you when you go. So there is great value in living in the moment and rejoicing in the present, too.
He was also very selfish. I mean, that all of that could have been shared with the community instead of tearing down his barn and building a bigger one just for himself.
Yeah.
It also makes me think of the myth that kindness is limited or that goodness is limited. It's unlimited, and to start giving it away instead of hoarding it, it keeps appearing, as opposed to the old thought that we've only got so much friendliness.
It's easy to live in a scarcity mindset is part of what I hear in that. What's still confusing in this parable? What questions are you left with? Sorry, I'm trying to get this connected again and see if we can make my screen not go to sleep so quickly. Okay, great, thank you. Would someone be willing to read that next parable? This was one of my favorites, the Prodigal Son. It's a long one, so if you get tired of reading, just pass the mic off to your neighbor. Up to you.
Luke 15:9 through 32. Then Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself and said, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He is lost and is found. They began to celebrate.
There's more on the back, but we can pause there. I think there's plenty to think about just in what Molly read for us. So again, those same questions. Who are our characters here, and what do they stand in for? What are the parallels to our modern life? And again, this could be as literal or as figurative as you like. The gift of parables. We can go lots of different places. So we might literally have a father and a son, right?
Well, the story, I think, about it could fit with any of us, literally a father and sons, but also all of us and our relationship with our Heavenly Father.
I'm glad you point that out, that it's both human relationships and, thank you, our relationship with God. That's the purpose of many of these parables that Jesus is telling, is that we're both instructed on how to act in our daily living and also instructed on how to build a relationship with God. And of course, we know God is the Father in this story who is always ready to bring us back into the fold and to celebrate our return. Who else could our characters or actions represent, or what else? We might think about the actions of the son who took the money from his father, took his inheritance, and then went and squandered it all. Again, that might be a literal using of all of your money and resources in ways that don't actually lead to your flourishing or the flourishing of others. But it could be small ways that we sin against God and our neighbor. There's lots of ways that we could interpret that. The son also talks about his hunger and that he would be perfectly willing to eat the food for the pigs, but wasn't even given that. In that, I hear perhaps a spiritual hunger as well, and knowledge that the world is not able to supply our needs in that way. So we have to return to the Father, return to God.
The son's transition into being empathic, understanding those who have so much less than him.
Yeah.
The son's transition into feeling empathy or being empathic towards the people who worked for his father, that based on asking for his inheritance, he probably didn't treat them so well, right? And so kind of a perspective change for the son.
That's true. What other meanings could we get from this?
It's interesting that Molly pointed out the son who went away, because I've always identified with the good son in this one, because I am, so perfect for myself. But it's been interesting for me. We've read this, several times the last couple of years, and sort of starting to. I have 2 children now, and starting to realize that I might have to start identifying with the father on this story more than I do with either of the sons.
Yeah, the good son is the part on the back that we didn't get to because this reading is just so long. But it's true, the good son who's still at home is really mad that the son who went off and spent all of his inheritance comes back and is given a party, the father rejoicing in that return. But I could see how the good son might be really resentful about that. And it is, of course, easy to see ourselves in that position.
I think the father's willingness to forgive or bring him back can't be understated. I think there are plenty of family dynamics where that just isn't granted. The transgression qualifies as too much. Not going to ever light the candle in the window again. I think that's a big deal.
Yeah, the sermon today talks a little bit about that, using a completely different passage, of course, from Luke, but not about return in this literal way. But it all comes together in that way. There's plenty of situations where it's hard to imagine this kind of return. both in our earthly families and with God. What's still confusing? What are we still wondering about as we read this?
I'm seeing the difference between the father's hired hands and then he called to his slaves later on. I wondered, I don't know if there's something significant there about.
That's a good question. Sometimes it's translation, but it's easy to pass it off just as a difference in translation, but maybe there is something deeper to uncover there. Certainly to our modern ears, there's a really different understanding of a hired hand versus a slave. It's a good question. And how might it feel different to ask the slaves to bring a robe to welcome this son than to ask someone who's being paid for their labor? Yeah, it's a good question. One that I don't think we could answer, but could certainly ponder about. What else are you curious about in this passage? There's a lot happening here. I always sort of wonder about the story behind the story. What was it that the son really desired when he asked for his inheritance? Was it freedom? Was it money? I'm sort of curious about his motivations. It doesn't change the meaning of it per se, but I want to know more about his personality and his motivations, and maybe even more about what he did with the money. Again, doesn't change the meaning, but is something to perhaps be curious about. And likewise, I'm curious about the life of the good son. What was he doing while the other son was off spending all of this money? I imagine helping his father on their land, helping take care of things, probably working pretty hard. And what was it like for that family when they sat down for dinner? Was the dad constantly saying, "Oh, well, where is your brother? I wish you were here with us." Curious about some of those family dynamics. Anything else you're wondering about there? Okay, we can go on to that third parable, Luke 18. Is there someone who would be willing to read that for us? Thank you.
Luke. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week, give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Thank you. Who are the characters here? What do they represent to us? This is one that it would be dangerous to take it too literally and to think that this is only about a Pharisee and a tax collector, both of whom get a really bad rap in the Gospels. I think especially we Christians have a particular understanding of who the Pharisees were, and it's not always completely accurate, so we want to make sure to think about who else could stand in for these characters. What are some parallels, or where do you see yourself in this? Yeah, the brother and these people might want to sit down and have coffee, talk it out. Yeah.
So the Pharisee stands for anyone who feels sort of self-satisfied and that they've arrived and figured everything out,
Yeah.
which is a danger.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of where we get a sort of potentially inaccurate understanding of the Pharisees. I think what you're saying is exactly right. The Pharisees were known for following the law to a T. And it makes sense how someone who has dedicated their whole life to following Jewish law exactly could have that sort of self-satisfied understanding. Yeah.
I think for me, it's a cautionary tale because, there's internal biases that we don't necessarily think about. I mean, sociologically, we know, racism bad, et cetera. But, I think we're all guilty of making little micro judgments for people that we don't align with. And so for me, that kind of makes me be mindful of where my unthought biases may lie.
Yeah, this might be more dramatic than how we are in our everyday life. We might just be thinking these things about someone. Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of tying the two parables together. So I'm a prodigal son. And as a prodigal son, when I remember that, I tend to be more honest about my flaws and not look down on people. But when I forget that, I can be like the guy saying, thank God I'm not like that person over there. So a lot of it's calling to mind my past and holding that present,
Yeah.
That's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, I appreciate you pointing out that most of us inhabit both of those roles at different points in our life or even different points in the day. Sometimes come evening when I've had a long day, I start turning into the Pharisee. Yeah, it's true. We can be both of those things. What meaning do we derive from this? What does this tell us about interpersonal relationships and also our relationship with God?
For me, it's that admitting mistakes and flaws is a good thing. It is a door into your relationship with God. I mean, that's kind of what I read from this parable. Rather than I've got it all together, well, then you're shutting the door, kind of. Kind of reminds me of the Richard Rohr thing of the false self, kind of wanting to separate yourselves and put yourself above others, whereas the task is kind of the downward journey of being like everyone else, being human, being flawed.
Yeah, God embraces all of that. But it's sort of a balancing act, too, because sometimes self-flagellation prevents us from going to God, too. A healthy understanding of self, I think, is what allows us to be in relationship with God. God's there no matter what, but I think we can receive it when we are neither too proud nor too down on ourselves. It's really easy to look at ourselves and say, well, I'm a horrible sinner, I'm not deserving of this relationship, which of course isn't true, but there are moments that we might feel like that. We might feel distance between ourselves and God and think that is right and justified. It's tricky. Being human and being Christian are both really hard. Yeah. What else do you learn from this?
Just building on what you were saying, I think that, Kelly knows this story, but this idea of calling myself a sinner, I feel like is troubling just in general. And I think that to me, it's like, how do you love yourself as you are so that you can be more open to being loved and loving? And not so much downtrodden on yourself, but celebrating yourself and loving yourself and loving and learning maybe from what you see around you, but not judging, but learning, and then also celebrating all that is. Like, how do you have compassion and love? And I feel like that's what I'm trying to pull out of this, because that language I feel like there's so much also oppression that was translated into some of these parables, and that is resonating also in our culture.
Yeah.
And so I feel like you can learn from this and think about it in this spirit of love and compassion.
I think that's right. But it's also worth naming that the word sinner can have different attachments for all of us, depending on the tradition you grew up in or even the specific preacher that you had growing up. There's a lot of ways that word, it holds a lot of meaning and varied meanings. I think even my understanding of what it is to call myself a sinner has changed over time, which is, that's also part of our journey with God. I don't feel downtrodden to call myself a sinner, but I can absolutely understand how someone could feel that way. I almost see that as a rejoicing. Like, yeah, I'm a sinner, and God loves me in that, and that's okay. And I always strive to be better, but it holds a lot. Mm-hmm.
Just kind of thinking about what you just said about love and compassion. When I look at that very last sentence, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble will be exalted, there's a part of me that wants to go, great, like, good, you'll get your just result, but if you look at that last sentence as the great equalizer, that those who are, that are exalted, on their way down, they meet the humbled coming up, and could be this really glorious place in the middle where compassion and love trips it all up, and we're all equal. And that's the way I want to look at that sentence, as the great equalizer and balance in love and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
I heard this thing, I don't know, some social media clip, and it might have been Brene Brown, but this woman was talking about how we can't help how we feel. We just have to acknowledge that. But we can control how we think about it and how we act about it. And I feel like sometimes when you are feeling things so deeply or so troubling, you turn to things like the Pharisees to be, what are the rules that I can follow, because I can't do it on my own, right? And so I just thought that was really poignant, that we can't control how we feel, but we can control how we act about it.
Yeah. I could talk about our feelings all day long. That's something that's really significant to me and my own spirituality, is the recognition of how we feel and naming it, so that we don't respond out of a potentially negative place, but we can name how we're feeling, perhaps name the causes of it, and then rather than jumping into the language the Pharisee uses about how everyone around us is horrible, we might perhaps approach God or approach another person and ask for mercy. Yeah. Something that also comes up to me as we talk about this in the rite for confession in the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church, the priest who's offering absolution names themselves as a sinner in that, which I think is really powerful, that it's two sinners sitting together and talking about the ways that they have sinned against God and sinned against one another. And I think it's important that we name that to each other rather than potentially, it's really easy to divide ourselves into us versus them. And that's part of what I hear in this parable is that we're all sort of on the same plane. It's just a matter of whether we are ready to recognize it. Yeah. Parables are really rich. I could sit and read parables and talk about them all day long. And especially there's many in Luke that I think are really beautiful and have a lot of meaning.
I guess I'd never read this parable about the prodigal son and this last one together, but that's exactly what happens in the prodigal son.
Yeah.
The one who was humbled by life circumstances was exalted by the father, and the one whose arrogance, who's,
Yeah.
I guess he was feeling he got a comeuppance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to read those two side by side. I hadn't read them that way before either, but there's a lot of overlap. Sometimes the characters that Jesus chooses, there's some threads that connect a lot of them, which perhaps points to what it is to be human, is to hold some of those characteristics. We'll move to those questions on the bottom of the back side of the handout. The point of why we're here, of course, is to talk about the Gospel of Luke, why Luke is an important witness to Jesus' life. So I'm curious, just from our reading today, why might parables be an important thing to include in a gospel? There's no right or wrong answer to that.
Speak to that generally as a storyteller. I know that when I was working for the Memphis Arts Council and going into classrooms and telling stories to like fourth graders, you can tell a story or a parable, and they're rich ones, very rich stories that are very entertaining, that seep into the marrow of your bones about consequences, for example, which are so much richer than just saying, don't do drugs.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like one of them in particular that I always told that has even helped me whenever I needed for it to come up out of my bones was a Brer Rabbit story. And those go all the way back in every culture. There are those cautionary tales that speak eloquently like a parable does rather than saying, don't do this.
Yeah. There's a reason that fables and fairy tales have lasted the test of time. Yeah. They teach us in a way that it's not so literal that we can just dismiss it. We read it as a story and are captured by it, and then learn through that. And we really hear it. Yes. Yes. Yeah. It might make for a shorter and perhaps easier to read gospel if Luke took the parable and just told us in a sentence what we were supposed to learn. But of course, there's a lot of richness lost in that, and our parables offer us opportunity for interpretation. But exactly as you said, there's power in story. Mm-hmm. Why might this be significant for a gospeler to include? All of the Gospels choose different things that Jesus said or did to include. Some of them probably really happened. Some of them might not have. Our memory is faulty, and sometimes there's a gift in that. But Luke's memory includes these parables. Yeah. In the middle, Kathy.
If you're wanting to start a movement, shaping your message in a story that someone then can repeat is really powerful.
Yeah.
To pass along.
Yeah, it's true. My partner Angela is a community organizer by training and also a Presbyterian pastor, but her work is all about using story to change culture. Kathy knows that work well too. There's great power in that, and it is a good way to start a movement It's true, yeah. The Jesus movement is very powerful because it is centered on story. It's powerful for a lot of reasons, but it works well for that reason, yeah. I know, I always discover things about my shoes walking back and forth.
So I wouldn't want to imply that anyone writing the gospel might be lying, but as a teacher, sometimes parables are really great because you're able to get points across that might actually not have happened in real life, but it's still something that you want to portray or you want to make people think about. And so I think that's also the power of the parables, is that if they just wrote how people experience the actual life, it's very limiting, right? So parables allow for that kind of expansive teaching and allow someone to get a point across that they didn't see the sun really leave or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's true. We can acknowledge that Luke may have changed some of the ways that things are communicated without it being a lie. Luke is a gifted writer, and sometimes gifted writers sort of adapt things knowing their audience and knowing how people will hear things and absorb things. Whether it is literal or not is almost never the point of our reading of the Bible. We still learn something from it, even if it is not word for word what Jesus said. Yeah.
In storytelling, we say all stories are true, some of them just haven't happened yet.
Yeah, I like that. At the second coming, Jesus will tell this word for word. Yeah. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story, says Molly. Yeah. What might we learn about Luke's priorities in his gospel by hearing these stories? Especially the three we heard today. Many of the parables in Luke have some similar themes. What were Luke's priorities? And I guess another way to say that is, how did Luke understand Jesus' earthly mission? The big theological questions of the Gospels.
Well, he seems to be saying what God honors, what God desires from us, and it's never it's always humility and grace and kindness. It's never that feeling that you're exalted. He's not for that.
Yeah.
I also think there's a strong message of the godliness of land ownership. So if you are a landowner and then you've squandered your land, that is a sin. And that is something that somehow you are, that it's just a message of how that's such an important thing somehow to do his story there.
Yeah. Which could be important to the audience or could be part of the message we receive. Many of the parables in Luke talk about, just looking at the titles of this, there's a lot about money. There's a lot about return and relationship. One of Luke's motives is having people, for lack of a better word, buy into the commonwealth of God, which is the kingdom of God. But there's a different understanding of wealth in the kingdom. And that's some of what is happening in Luke. The rich fool, the lost coin, the prodigal son, all sort of make us question what is of value.
Orgs meeting Jesus for the first time, again, after many, many years. And I feel like, to answer your question today, after reading last night, that Luke is just trying to make sure that the teachings of Jesus are carried on. And he knows that a good way to do that is to do it through parable. It was very smart of him to do it that way, I think.
Yes, yes. And each of our gospelers has a different way of communicating Jesus' message and mission. I think we'll end there. Thank y'all. It's always rich to hear the different ways that we're being touched by Scripture. So that's just a little bit about why Luke, our gifted storyteller.